The sirens wailed through the quiet night as the red and blue lights flickered against the luxurious estate. A squad of uniformed officers stormed the grand marble entrance, their hands resting on their holsters as they approached a trembling, tear-streaked blonde girl wrapped in a silk robe. He attacked me," she sobbed, pointing a shaky finger at the man kneeling in the driveway, his dark skin glistening under the security lights. His clothes were torn, his lip was bleeding, and his eyes, wide with shock, darted between the officers and the girl. "I swear I didn't," the man stammered, but before he could finish, the officers pounced. "Hands behind your head." A knee drove into his back, shoving him onto the cold pavement. The girl, Emily Westwood, the only daughter of billionaire developer Richard Westwood, shivered as a detective draped a blanket over her shoulders. "You're safe now," he assured her. "I trusted him," she whispered. "And her voice broke, and that was all they needed." Two officers hauled the driver, Jamal Carter, to his feet and marched him toward the squad car. His face was frozen in disbelief. "Emily, please. You know I would never." "Shut up," one of the officers barked, slamming him against the car. Tears rolled down Emily's cheeks as she buried her face into her hands, her sobs shaking her fragile body. But behind those trembling hands was a smirk. She had won. Jamal Carter, the man who had the audacity to turn down her advances, was going to rot in prison. And no one, absolutely no one, would ever doubt the word of a billionaire's daughter. Or so she thought. 2 years later, a heavy rain poured over the cemetery as a crowd dressed in black stood under large umbrellas. The priest's voice was drowned out by the storm, but the weight of grief hung thick in the air. In the distance, just outside the cemetery gates, a woman stood alone in the rain. Her once pristine designer dress was soaked, her once perfect hair a tangled mess. Her face, once adored by the press, was pale, gaunt, and hollow-eyed. Emily Westwood was unrecognizable. Her lips trembled as she watched her father's casket being lowered into the ground. Richard Westwood, billionaire, business tycoon, and the man who had shielded her from every consequence, was dead. And Emily knew, deep in her gut, that karma had finally come for her. Because this was only the beginning. 2 years earlier, before the lie that ruined a life, before the betrayal that destroyed her family, before the downward spiral that left her with nothing, Emily Westwood had everything. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Emily Westwood had the world at her feet. At just 20 years old, she was the princess of the Westwood Empire. Born into unimaginable wealth, she never had to work a day in her life. The media adored her, her social media following was in the millions, and any mistake she made, any scandal, was wiped away by her father's army of lawyers. But behind the picture-perfect Instagram posts and the lavish parties was a girl who was never told no. And the first person who dared to reject her was Jamal Carter. Jamal had worked for the Westwood family for 3 years. He was reliable, hard-working, and, unlike most of the staff, he never fawned over Emily. To him, she was just another spoiled rich girl. He drove her to parties, picked her up from clubs when she was too drunk to stand, and ignored her when she threw tantrums. That was what made her want him. One night, after a particularly wild party, Emily slumped into the back seat of her father's Rolls-Royce. Her designer dress clung to her body, and the expensive perfume on her skin mixed with the scent of alcohol. Jamal didn't say a word as he pulled out of the driveway, his eyes fixed on the road. Emily, bored and tipsy, leaned forward, resting her chin on his shoulder. "You know, you're kind of hot," she slurred. Jamal's grip on the steering wheel tightened, but he didn't respond. She ran a manicured finger down his arm. "I bet you think about me sometimes, don't you?" Jamal sighed. "Miss Westwood, sit back. You're drunk." Her lips curled into a pout. "So what? You don't like me?" Jamal kept his voice calm. "I'm your driver, not your boyfriend." Emily's eyes darkened. She wasn't used to being rejected. "You're acting like you're better than me," she sneered. "Like you don't want this." Jamal exhaled sharply. "Miss Westwood, please. Stop the car." Jamal glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Excuse me." "I said, stop the damn car," she snapped. With a quiet sigh, Jamal pulled over to the side of the empty road. Emily pushed the door open and stepped out, the cool night air hitting her flushed skin. Jamal followed, his patience wearing thin. "What are you doing?" She turned to face him, a wicked smirk on her lips. "Kiss me." Jamal took a step back. "Go home, Emily." Her expression twisted with fury. "You don't get to tell me what to do." "I'm not interested," Jamal said firmly. The words stung more than they should have. Emily Westwood, daughter of one of the most powerful men in the country, had just been rejected by a driver. A driver. Her pride burned. She had two choices: walk away or ruin him. She chose the latter. With a sharp inhale, she dug her nails into her own arms, dragging them down her skin until red welts appeared. Then she ripped the strap of her dress, letting it fall over her shoulder. Jamal's eyes widened. "What are you?" Before he could finish, she screamed. A bone-chilling, blood-curdling scream. Jamal froze as she collapsed onto the ground, sobbing hysterically. "Help! Help me!" she shrieked into the night. Jamal took a step back, horror dawning on his face. "Emily!" Lights flashed in the distance. Someone had heard her cries. Jamal's blood ran cold. This was bad. Very, very bad. 1 week later. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the gallery, their cameras clicking furiously as Emily sat on the witness stand, a picture of fragile innocence. "I trusted him," she whispered, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "He was my driver. I never thought he would." She broke into a sob, her body trembling. Across the room, Jamal sat in an orange jumpsuit, his wrists cuffed, his face unreadable. Richard Westwood sat in the front row, his jaw tight, his powerful presence looming over the courtroom. He didn't need to say a word. His money would do all the talking. The judge banged his gavel. "Mr. Carter, you are hereby denied bail and will remain in custody until trial." Jamal's heart sank. Emily's lips curled ever so slightly. She had won. For now. 2 years before karma struck. Jamal sat in his cold gray jail cell, staring at the cracked ceiling above him. He had been in here for weeks now, and the reality was beginning to sink in. He was facing decades behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. His court-appointed lawyer had made it clear, fighting against the Westwood family was a lost cause. "They have money. They have power. They have influence," the lawyer had told him. "The jury will see a rich, blonde, young woman sobbing on the stand and a big, strong black man accused of hurting her. Who do you think they'll believe?" Jamal clenched his fists. This wasn't just about race, power, or money. This was about injustice. Emily Westwood had taken everything from him. His job, his freedom, his reputation. His mother had broken down in tears when she visited him. "Baby, tell me you didn't do this," she had whispered, her hands shaking. Jamal had looked her dead in the eyes. "I swear on everything, Mama. I didn't do it." She believed him. But belief wasn't enough. He needed proof. And right now, all he had was the truth. Which meant nothing in a world where billionaires controlled everything. Meanwhile, in the Westwood mansion, Emily was celebrating. Her father had thrown her a private party at their estate, with champagne flowing and a live band playing her favorite songs. "You were so brave, sweetheart," Richard Westwood said, kissing the top of her head. "I'll make sure he never sees the light of day again." Emily smirked behind her wine glass. She had expected her father to be mad. After all, her little stunt could have been messy. But Richard was more concerned with covering up the scandal than questioning the truth. She was untouchable. The media had painted her as a survivor, the brave billionaire's daughter who had spoken out against a predator. Social media was flooded with hashtags. Hashtag justice for Emily, hashtag believe women, hashtag monsters among us. Jamal had no chance. Or so she thought. Because in the corner of the party, her father's business partner, William Shaw, was watching her carefully. He had known Richard Westwood for 20 years. He had seen Emily throw tantrums as a child, lie her way out of trouble as a teenager, and now, as an adult, he saw the same deceit in her eyes. Something wasn't adding up. And William Shaw wasn't the type of man to ignore his instincts. 2 months later, Jamal sat in the courtroom once again, his hands cuffed tightly. The trial was moving faster than he had expected. Witnesses had been called. Emily had given her emotional testimony. The prosecution painted him as a monster. And then, the surveillance footage surfaced. A new lawyer had taken over Jamal's case, a sharp, fearless woman named Vanessa Cole. She had spent weeks digging for evidence, and she found it. A private security camera from a house near the scene of the attack had captured everything. The video showed Emily walking out of the car, standing with Jamal for a few moments, then suddenly throwing herself onto the ground, screaming like a wild animal. The entire courtroom went silent. Emily's face turned ghost white. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Miss Westwood, would you like to explain this?" Emily stammered, her perfect composure crumbling. I was scared. I didn't mean." Her lawyer buried his face in his hands. The courtroom erupted into chaos. The prosecution dropped the case immediately. The handcuffs were removed from Jamal's wrists, and he stood up, his chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. He was free. But Emily Westwood had no idea. Her nightmare was just beginning. Emily Westwood's world was crumbling. The moment the surveillance footage was played in court, everything changed. The same media that had once painted her as a brave survivor turned on her in an instant. Billionaire's daughter caught in shocking false accusation scandal. Emily Westwood lied. Innocent man jailed for months. Is this the biggest hoax in court history? The headlines were brutal. As she left the courthouse, cameras flashed in her face, reporters yelling over each other. "Emily, do you have anything to say? Why did you lie? Do you think you should go to jail?" Her hands trembled as she pushed through the crowd, her father gripping her wrist tightly. "Keep your head down," he muttered. They barely made it to the black SUV before reporters swarmed the doors. As soon as the doors shut, Emily turned to her father, her voice shaking. "Dad, you'll fix this, right?" For the first time in her life, Richard Westwood didn't respond right away. His jaw was clenched so tight, she could see the veins in his neck pulsing. Finally, he exhaled sharply. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Emily's stomach twisted. She had never heard her father speak to her like this. She started, but Richard cut her off. "You didn't just lie, Emily. You nearly destroyed a man's life. And now, you've destroyed ours." Emily's breath hitched. "What are you talking about?" Richard rubbed his temples, his anger barely contained. "William Shaw called me. Our investors are pulling out. Stock prices are tanking. Every business deal I've worked on for years is falling apart because of you." Emily swallowed hard. "But, you can fix it, right?" Richard gave a bitter laugh. "You think money can fix everything, don't you?" For the first time in her life, Emily wasn't sure if her father could save her. Meanwhile, Jamal Carter stood outside the courthouse, staring up at the gray sky. He was free. But he wasn't the same man who had been dragged out of his home in handcuffs. The months in jail had changed him. The whispers of other inmates, the guards who looked at him like he was filth, the sleepless nights wondering if he'd ever see the outside world again, it had hardened him. Vanessa Cole, his lawyer, stepped beside him. "The Westwoods are going to come after you," she said bluntly. "They'll try to settle. Pay you off. Make this disappear." Jamal's jaw tightened. "I don't want their money." Vanessa smirked. "Good. Because I have a better idea." Jamal turned to her. "What do you mean?" She pulled a folder from her briefcase and handed it to him. "We're going to sue them." Jamal flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the documents. False accusations, defamation, wrongful imprisonment. The case was airtight. Emily Westwood wasn't going to walk away from this. Not this time. Days later, the lawsuit hit the media like an earthquake. $50 million lawsuit filed against Westwood family. Jamal Carter seeks justice, and he might win. Emily Westwood faces ruin. The Westwood estate turned into a war zone. Richard Westwood had spent his life untouchable, but now, the lawsuits, the investors backing out, and the outrage from the public had backed him into a corner. But the real damage was happening behind closed doors. "Emily, this is bigger than just you," Richard snapped as they sat in their grand dining hall, which suddenly felt much smaller. "If we lose this lawsuit, we could lose everything." Emily's face was pale. "So, what do we do?" Richard pinched the bridge of his nose. "We settle. We pay him off, and we move on." But then, the door burst open. It was William Shaw. And he looked furious. He dropped a stack of papers onto the table. "Richard, we have a bigger problem." Emily's heart pounded as she read the first page. Jamal Carter files criminal charges against Emily Westwood. Her nightmare had only just begun. Emily's fingers trembled as she read the words on the paper. Criminal charges. She looked up at her father, panic rising in her throat. "This can't be real," she whispered. But it was. Richard Westwood grabbed the papers, his expression unreadable as he scanned the contents. False police report. Perjury. Defamation. He muttered under his breath. William Shaw crossed his arms. "It's worse than that, Richard. The DA is considering filing charges against Emily. If they do, and if she's convicted, she could be looking at prison time." The words prison time sent a violent shudder through Emily's body. "No," she blurted. "No, this isn't happening." She turned to her father, expecting him to fix everything, like he always had. But Richard didn't speak. Instead, he stood up, walked to the liquor cabinet, and poured himself a glass of scotch. It was the first time Emily had ever seen fear in his eyes, and that terrified her. Meanwhile, Jamal Carter sat across from Vanessa Cole in a sleek, modern office. Unlike the cold, lifeless walls of a prison cell, this room smelled like justice. Vanessa tapped her manicured nails against the table. "They're going to offer you a massive settlement," she said. "I wouldn't be surprised if Richard Westwood throws $20 million at you just to make this go away." Jamal leaned forward, his eyes burning with something deeper than anger. Righteous fury. "They took a year of my life," he said, his voice steady. "They threw me in a cell like I was an animal. They let the whole world believe I was a rapist." He exhaled sharply. "Money doesn't erase that." Vanessa smirked. "That's why we're going after her criminally." She slid a folder across the desk. "Emily Westwood isn't getting away with a fine. She's going to see the inside of a courtroom as a defendant." Jamal picked up the folder, his pulse steady. "Good," he said. "Let's end this." 1 week later, Emily Westwood was used to cameras following her. She had grown up in the spotlight, the darling of gossip magazines and social media. But this was different. She walked into the courthouse with her father, her designer sunglasses doing nothing to hide the exhaustion in her eyes. The crowd outside was ruthless. Justice for Jamal. Lock her up. No more privilege. No more lies. Emily clenched her fists. How did it come to this? Inside, the courtroom was packed. On one side, Emily and her father sat stiffly with their lawyers. On the other, Jamal Carter, his lawyer, and a silent, waiting jury. The judge's voice cut through the tension. "Miss Westwood, you are being charged with making a false police report, obstruction of justice, and defamation. How do you plead?" Emily's throat was dry. Her father squeezed her hand under the table. "Say not guilty," he hissed. Emily licked her lips, her heart slamming against her ribs. Her entire life had been built on lies. Now, those lies were catching up with her. She took a deep breath. "Not guilty." The courtroom erupted. Jamal didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply watched as the girl who had destroyed his life continued to lie. But that was fine, because the truth was coming for her. And it wouldn't be gentle. What do you think? Should Emily have pleaded guilty? Or is she just delaying the inevitable? Drop a comment below and let us know. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The courtroom was still buzzing from Emily's not guilty plea. The reporters, the public, even the jury seemed taken aback. But no one was more disappointed than Jamal Carter. She still wasn't taking responsibility. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. The prosecution may proceed. Vanessa Cole stood, her confidence razor-sharp. "Your Honor, we intend to prove beyond a doubt that Emily Westwood knowingly and maliciously made false accusations against my client, resulting in his wrongful imprisonment." She turned to the jury, her voice smooth but firm. "Miss Westwood didn't just ruin a man's reputation. She stole a year of his life. And we are here today to hold her accountable." Emily shifted uncomfortably in her seat, feeling the weight of those words. Her father, Richard, whispered beside her. "Stay calm. We'll handle this." Emily clenched her jaw. "I don't understand why this is even happening. People lie all the time. Why am I the one being punished? Richard gave her a sharp look. Because you got caught. Emily's stomach twisted. Jamal sat tall, his voice steady. I worked for the Westwoods for 3 years. I never disrespected Emily. Never spoke out of line. I did my job. Vanessa nodded. And on the night in question, Jamal exhaled. She made a pass at me. I turned her down. He looked directly at Emily now, his eyes cold. I told her no. And she destroyed my life for it. Emily shrunk under his stare. Vanessa turned to the jury. Let's talk about the evidence. A large screen lit up, showing the surveillance footage from that night. The jury watched every second. Emily walking out of the car, talking to Jamal. Emily tearing her dress strap. Emily clawing at her own skin before throwing herself onto the ground and screaming. And then, Emily's smirk. That split second before the camera cut off, when she thought no one was watching. The jury saw it. The judge saw it. The entire world saw it. Emily froze. She could hear the whispers behind her. She was losing. Fast. Emily's lawyer, Philip Grant, stood. He was good, one of the best money could buy. Miss Westwood was in a highly emotional state that night. He began smoothly. She had been drinking. She was confused. She may have misremembered events. Jamal's fists clenched. Misremembered. Philip turned to Emily. Miss Westwood, would you say you were intoxicated that night? Emily swallowed. Why, yes. Philip nodded. And when you woke up the next day, were you sure about what happened? Emily hesitated. She glanced at her father. Richard gave a tiny nod. Stick to the story. Emily turned back to the jury, her voice wavering. I thought I was sure. Philip nodded, his expression sympathetic. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we're not here to villainize a young woman who made a mistake. We're here to determine if she deliberately sought to harm Mr. Carter. And I argue that she did not. It was a good argument. For a second, Emily felt relief. Maybe she could still win. But then, Vanessa stood up. And Emily's relief shattered. Miss Westwood, Vanessa said, her tone deadly calm. You just testified that you were drunk that night. Emily nodded quickly. Yes. Vanessa flipped open a file. Then tell me, how did you remember exactly what to say to the police? Your statement was detailed. You described the attack in perfect order. You even cried in front of officers, saying Jamal had held you down, that you could still feel his hands on you. Emily paled. I don't know. Vanessa took one step closer. Miss Westwood, if you were so drunk, how did you give such a clear and detailed statement? Silence. The jury watched. Emily's hands started to shake. I just... Vanessa didn't let up. Isn't it true, Miss Westwood, that you knew exactly what you were doing? That you fabricated this entire story because Jamal rejected you? Emily's throat closed. Vanessa's voice turned sharp. You said you were confused. That you misremembered. But you weren't confused when you went on national television crying about how violated you felt. You weren't confused when you let an innocent man rot in a jail cell for months. Emily's heart pounded. I didn't mean... Vanessa's voice cut through her like a knife. Then why did you smirk? The screen behind her replayed the footage. That moment. That 1 second where Emily thought no one was looking. Emily's body locked up. She couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Couldn't move. The jury had seen it. And their minds were made up. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Emily could feel her father staring at her. Could feel the eyes of the world pressing down on her. She had one option left. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I was scared, she whimpered. I thought he was going to hurt me. I don't know why Vanessa's voice turned ice cold. Save it, Emily. Emily's breath hitched. Vanessa folded her arms. You lied. You destroyed a man's life. And now you're trying to cry your way out of it. Emily looked at the jury. They were stone-faced. No one believed her anymore. And for the first time in her privileged, untouchable life, Emily Westwood knew she was going to lose. The courtroom was silent. Emily Westwood sat frozen in her chair, her face streaked with tears, her heart slamming against her ribs. She had lost control. For the first time in her life, her last name meant nothing. Her father's power meant nothing. The world saw her for what she was. A liar. A fraud. A criminal. She turned to her father in desperation. "Dad." But Richard Westwood wasn't looking at her. His jaw was clenched, his fingers pressed against his temples as if trying to block out the chaos unfolding around them. Because this wasn't just her downfall. It was his too. Vanessa Cole stepped back to her table, exuding the confidence of someone who knew she had already won. "Your Honor," she said, looking at the judge. "The prosecution has no further questions at this time." The judge nodded, then turned to Emily's defense attorney. "Mr. Grant, would the defense like to cross-examine?" Philip Grant hesitated. He knew there was nothing left to salvage. He had been in this business long enough to recognize when a case was over. But Emily Westwood wasn't just any client, she was a Westwood. And if there was one thing the rich and powerful never did, it was accept defeat. He stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and turned to Emily with a forced, reassuring smile. "Miss Westwood," he said smoothly, "I know this must be overwhelming for you." Emily gripped the edge of the witness stand like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "Why, yes," she stammered. Philip nodded sympathetically, then turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've heard a lot today. We've seen clips, edited footage, that the prosecution claims proves my client's guilt. But we must ask ourselves, is a single moment of misinterpretation enough to condemn a person?" He paced the courtroom like a seasoned performer. "My client has been publicly humiliated. She has received death threats. She has lost everything because of one mistake." He turned to Emily. "Miss Westwood, do you regret what happened?" Emily swallowed hard, eyes darting between her lawyer and the jury. She knew what they wanted to hear. She had no choice. "Yes," she whispered. Philip nodded, turning back to the jury. "There you have it. A young woman who made a terrible mistake, one that she will carry for the rest of her life. But does she deserve to be branded a criminal? Does she deserve prison?" The courtroom was still. Philip's gaze softened. "She's suffered enough." He turned back to the judge. "No further questions." He sat down, giving Emily a slight nod. Hope. For the first time all trial, she felt hope. Maybe the jury would sympathize. Maybe she wouldn't go to prison. Maybe she could still escape this. Jamal's turn to speak. "Your Honor," Vanessa stood again, her expression unreadable, "the prosecution would like to call one final witness. Jamal Carter." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Jamal stood, adjusting his suit as he approached the witness stand. He had spent a year being silenced, treated like a criminal, cast out from society. No. Now it was his turn to be heard. Vanessa walked up to him, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Carter, do you believe Emily Westwood is truly sorry for what she did?" Jamal turned his head, locking eyes with Emily. She flinched. Then he spoke. "No." One word. And it sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Vanessa nodded. "And why not?" Jamal leaned forward, voice steady. "Unbreakable. Because she didn't just make a mistake. She made a choice. A choice to lie. A choice to let me rot in a jail cell. A choice to let the world believe I was a monster." The jury hung on his every word. Jamal's voice hardened. "She sat in her mansion while I sat in a cage. She went to parties while my own mother looked me in the eyes, asking if I was a rapist." A murmur spread through the gallery. Jamal exhaled, steadying himself. "And she only regrets it because she got caught." He turned back to the jury. "I lost a year of my life. But what if there was no video? What if no one believed me? I could have lost everything." His voice turned cold. "She was willing to let that happen." Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Emily felt a lump in her throat. Her hope was gone. Because now, the jury wasn't looking at her like a victim. They were looking at her like a criminal. And she knew, this was over. The verdict approaches. The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. "We will take a recess before proceeding with closing arguments." He banged the gavel. The trial wasn't officially over, but Emily knew. She had already lost. As the courtroom cleared, Emily turned to her father, desperate. "Dad, please do something." But Richard didn't look at her. He was already on his phone, texting, calling, distancing himself from her. Because his empire was crumbling too. For the first time in her privileged life, Emily was truly alone. And the worst was yet to come. The courtroom had never felt smaller. Emily Westwood sat at the defense table, her hands clenched in her lap, her pulse pounding in her ears. This wasn't a nightmare. This was real. And she was about to hear her fate. The jury had deliberated for only 3 hours. That was a bad sign. If they had taken days, maybe she could have hoped for a hung jury. But 3 hours? That meant they had made up their minds fast. And it wasn't in her favor. The judge re-entered, his face unreadable. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" A middle-aged woman stood, holding a sheet of paper. "We have, Your Honor." Emily's breath hitched. The bailiff took the paper and handed it to the judge. He skimmed it, then gave a small nod. "Please read the verdict." The woman cleared her throat. "On the charge of making a false police report, we find the defendant guilty." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Emily's body locked up. The woman continued, her voice steady. "On the charge of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of defamation, we find the defendant guilty. 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 Guilty." The word rang in Emily's ears like a gunshot. Her heart sank into her stomach. She had lost. Chaos erupts. Reporters bolted from the courtroom to break the news. Breaking, Emily Westwood found guilty on all charges. The end of the Westwood empire. Justice for Jamal Carter. Verdict shocks the nation. The judge banged his gavel, calling for silence. Emily turned to her father, desperate. "Dad." But Richard Westwood didn't look at her. He was still on his phone. Texting. Calling. Not to save her. To save himself. And that's when it hit her. Her father had given up on her. Sentencing. The judge sighed, looking over the files in front of him. "Miss Westwood, do you have anything to say before sentencing?" Emily opened her mouth, but nothing came out. What could she say? That she was sorry? That she didn't mean it? That she didn't think it would go this far? No one would believe her. Not anymore. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Miss Westwood, your actions led to the wrongful imprisonment of an innocent man. You abused your privilege and manipulated the justice system. And worst of all, you did it without remorse." Emily's nails dug into her palm. "Please, please don't send me to prison." The judge sighed heavily. "I hereby sentence you to 6 years in state prison." Emily gasped. 6 years. Her body shook. She whipped her head to her father, her voice frantic. "Dad, do something." But Richard Westwood didn't even flinch. He didn't move. Emily's world collapsed. The bailiff approached, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. And for the first time in her life, Emily Westwood felt true powerlessness. As the cold metal locked around her wrists, she let out a strangled sob. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to be untouchable. But karma didn't care about last names. And now she was just another prisoner. Jamal's final words. Jamal Carter watched in silence as Emily was led away in handcuffs. She didn't look like a princess anymore. She didn't look powerful or invincible. She looked small. Vanessa Cole leaned over to him. "How do you feel?" Jamal exhaled. He had dreamed of this moment. Dreamed of seeing justice served. But now that it was here, he didn't feel victory. He just felt tired. "I feel like it's finally over," he murmured. Vanessa nodded. "It is." But as he watched Emily Westwood disappear behind the courtroom doors, Jamal realized something. It wasn't over for her. For Emily Westwood. The metal doors of the women's state prison slammed shut behind Emily Westwood, sealing her fate. She flinched at the harsh clang, her wrists still sore from the handcuffs. This wasn't some high-end rehab center. This wasn't house arrest in a penthouse. This was prison. And she had 6 years to survive it. A female corrections officer walked ahead of her. "Keep up, Westwood. This ain't a country club." Emily swallowed hard and shuffled forward, her brand-new orange jumpsuit stiff against her skin. Her heels had been taken. Her designer jewelry stripped away. Her hair extensions cut out. For the first time in her life, she wasn't Emily Westwood, Billionaire's daughter. She was just another inmate. And the other prisoners? They knew exactly who she was. First night in prison. The moment Emily stepped into the crowded cell block, eyes turned to her. Whispers rippled through the air. "That's her. She's the rich chick who lied. She put a man in jail for no reason. Think she's still daddy's little princess in here?" Emily's stomach twisted. She had spent her whole life in luxury. She had never gone a day without her needs met. No. Now she had nothing. "Welcome to hell, Westwood," a guard muttered as he opened the cell door. Inside was a tiny, cold room with 2 metal bunk beds and a single toilet in the corner. Her new cellmate was sitting on the bottom bunk, a tall, broad-shouldered woman covered in tattoos. The woman looked up, her expression unreadable. Then she let out a dark chuckle. Well, look what we got here." Emily froze. The woman smirked. "You really thought you could just lie about a man like that and walk away?" Emily's throat went dry. She suddenly realized. She wasn't safe. Not in here. Meanwhile, Jamal Carter sat on his front porch, watching the sunset. For the first time in 2 years, he could finally breathe. His name was cleared. His lawsuit against the Westwoods had been settled out of court, and while he wasn't a billionaire, he would never have to work another day in his life if he didn't want to. But it wasn't about the money. It was about justice. His lawyer, Vanessa, sat beside him, sipping her iced coffee. "So, what's next for you?" Jamal sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know. Maybe I'll travel. Maybe I'll write a book." Vanessa smirked. "You should. How I Survived the Westwoods, a story of lies, power, and karma." Jamal chuckled. "You think anyone would read it?" Vanessa took a sip of her drink. "After everything that happened?" "Oh, absolutely." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything finally lifting off Jamal's shoulders. Then Vanessa glanced at her phone and smirked. "By the way," she said, turning the screen toward him, "Emily's first prison mugshot just dropped." Jamal glanced at the screen. Emily Westwood's face stared back at him. Her usual perfect smile gone. Her flawless makeup smeared. Her eyes empty. Jamal studied the picture for a moment. Then he handed the phone back. "I don't need to see that," he said. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "Really? No satisfaction at all?" Jamal sighed. "I already got my justice." Vanessa nodded slowly. "Fair enough." Jamal exhaled, watching the sun dip lower. It was over. Finally. And Emily? She was exactly where she deserved to be. Back in prison. Emily curled up on the bottom bunk, her body trembling. Her first night in jail had been a wake-up call. Her cellmate made sure of that. The woman had leaned in, whispering into her ear, "Rich girl, you better keep your head down. 'Cause in here, ain't nobody gonna clean up your mess." Emily's breath was shaky as she stared at the cracked ceiling. Her father hadn't called. Her friends had abandoned her. Her life was over. And for the first time ever, no one was coming to save her. Emily Westwood woke up to the harsh buzz of the prison alarm. Her first week behind bars had been hell. She had quickly learned that the privilege she had once flaunted meant nothing in here. No special treatment. No personal chefs. No daddy's money to fix things. Here, she was just inmate number 24893. Her cellmate, Tanya, had made it clear on day one. "This ain't your world, princess. You better learn fast." And she had. She had no choice. Outside of prison, the Westwood name was collapsing. With Emily convicted, Richard Westwood's empire took a hit it would never recover from. Stock prices plummeted. Business partners distanced themselves. Then came the federal investigation. Emily's trial had uncovered financial fraud, tax evasion, and multiple scandals that Richard had buried for years. The government came knocking. The once untouchable billionaire was now facing serious charges of his own. Karma hadn't just come for Emily. It had come for her entire family. 2 months into her 6-year sentence, Emily had changed. The softness was gone. The arrogance had been crushed. Every day was a battle. She had learned to keep her head down, to avoid trouble. But prison had a way of breaking even the toughest people. And Emily, she had never been tough. One night, as she lay awake on her thin cot, Tanya sat on the other bunk, studying her. "You ever think about what you did?" Tanya asked. Emily hesitated. Before, she would have lied. Would have played the victim. "No." She sighed. "Yeah." Tanya raised an eyebrow. "And?" Emily exhaled. "I ruined someone's life. Over nothing." Tanya scoffed. "No, girl. You ruined your own life. You just took him down with you." Emily looked away. For once, she had nothing to say. Because Tanya was right. While Emily adjusted to life behind bars, Jamal Carter was building a new life. With the settlement money, he started a foundation for victims of false accusations. He had been given a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. One afternoon, as he walked through his new office, his phone rang. It was Vanessa. "Guess who just got arrested?" she said with a smirk. Jamal frowned. "Who?" "Richard Westwood." Jamal froze. He had thought this was over. But karma had one last trick up its sleeve. Richard Westwood was dragged from his penthouse in handcuffs. Fraud. Money laundering. Corporate crimes. The same legal system he had manipulated for years had finally caught up with him. The Westwood name, once a symbol of power, was now a disgrace. Jamal watched the news, shaking his head. He didn't feel joy. Just closure. Justice had been served. And now, he could finally move forward. Months passed. Emily stopped counting the days. She knew she would never be the same person again. She didn't know what would happen when she got out. Would she disappear? Would she try to rebuild? She didn't have the answers. But for the first time, she wasn't lying to herself. She had done this. She had ruined herself. And no one was coming to save her. Not her father. Not her money. Not her lies. She was on her own. And she would have to live with that. What did you think of Emily's fate? Did she deserve everything she got, or should she have had a second chance? Drop your final thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping stories.